The last red Commodore sat at the end of the line. It was the morning of October 20th, 2017. Inside the Holden assembly plant on Phillip Highway, Elizabeth, South Australia, roughly 1,000 people had gathered. Workers in steel-cap boots, union delegates in high-vis vests, retired hands who had driven up from the southern suburbs before dawn. Some had spent 30 years on that floor. Some had fathers who had spent 30 years before them. The car was a V8 sedan, deep red, trim and quiet under the fluorescent lights. At some point before midday, it moved forward for the last time. 7,600,000 vehicles. That was the Holden tally, from the first EH pressed in this building in 1963. To this, the line went still, the room did not cheer. Several people wept. But here is what the cameras did not show that morning. By the time that red Commodore rolled out of Elizabeth, the industry that had built it was already gone. Not closing, gone. The panel beaters, the die casters, the wiring harness makers, the seat fabricators, the men and women in the smaller sheds across the northern suburbs of Adelaide who had quietly supplied every one of those 7 million cars. Most of them had already switched off their machines months earlier, with no ceremony at all. This is not the story of Holden. This is the story of the people Holden left behind. Chapter 1. Origin. A city built on promise, Elizabeth, 1955 to 1963. There is a particular kind of optimism that belongs only to the years after a war. A belief, fierce, almost religious, that if enough hands were put to work, if enough concrete was poured and enough steel was bent into shape, then a country could build itself into something permanent. Something that would last. In South Australia in the mid-1950s, that optimism had a postcode. Elizabeth was not a town that grew organically. It was designed. In 1955, the South Australian government drew it into existence on a flat plain 26 kilometres north of Adelaide. A planned city conceived from the outset as a place where working people would live and work within walking distance of one another. The South Australian Housing Trust, the state body charged with building it, constructed thousands of homes in neat rows across land that had been, not long before, scrub and paddock. There were schools, churches, shopping strips and ovals for the footy club. Everything a community needed, everything except one thing: a reason to be there. That reason arrived in 1958, when General Motors Holden signed an agreement with the South Australian government to establish a manufacturing presence in Elizabeth. The site chosen was on Phillip Highway, a broad, flat stretch at the northern edge of the new suburb, close enough to the housing trust homes that workers could hear the plant from their back verandas on a still morning. Initially, the facility pressed and fabricated car bodies. The finished shells were then transported south to Holden's older Woodville plant for final assembly. It was not yet a complete operation, but it was a beginning. And in Elizabeth, beginnings mattered enormously. The families moving into the housing trust homes in those years came from everywhere, from the United Kingdom and Italy and Greece, from country South Australia, from the inner suburbs of Adelaide. Many of the men had trade qualifications, others had nothing except willingness. What Elizabeth offered them was simple and at the time seemed unbreakable: a steady wage, a roof over their heads, and work that meant something because you could see what you had made at the end of the shift. By 1963, the transformation was complete. Holden consolidated its South Australian operations at Elizabeth, and the plant became a full assembly facility. The first vehicle produced there under the new arrangement was the Holden EH, a car that would become one of the most fondly remembered models in Australian automotive history. Clean lines, local engineering made by South Australian hands. Around the Holden plant, something else began to take shape. A factory of the size and complexity of Elizabeth could not function alone. It needed hundreds of components: pressed metal panels, rubber seals, wiring looms, glass, trim, upholstery, brake assemblies, fuel systems. Some of these parts came from interstate suppliers, but increasingly, a constellation of smaller manufacturers established themselves in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, positioning themselves close to their single most important customer. These were not large companies. Many were family operations. A shed, a press, a dozen workers, a contract with Holden that represented virtually all of their revenue. They made specialised components for specific models. They invested in tooling calibrated to Holden's specifications. They hired workers from the same streets, sent their children to the same schools, drank at the same pubs after knock-off on a Friday. They were, in every meaningful sense, part of the same organism as the plant on Phillip Highway. They simply did not have Holden's name on the gate. And here is the thing about building an entire community, an entire ecosystem of livelihoods around a single employer and a single industry. It works magnificently, right up until it doesn't. In 1963, nobody in Elizabeth was thinking about that. The line was running, the pay was coming, the suburb was filling up with young families and second-hand televisions, and the particular noise of a place that believes it has a future. That belief was not naive, it was earned. And for the next 2 decades, Elizabeth would give the people who lived and worked there every reason in the world to keep believing. Chapter 2. The machine at its peak. The line at full roar. Elizabeth in its prime, 1970s to 1990s. There is a sound that people who worked at Elizabeth in the 1970s still describe the same way, decades later. Not one sound exactly, more like a layering of sounds that, taken together, became the ambient noise of an entire suburb. The thud of the stamping presses, the hiss of the paint booths, the clatter of the conveyor chain pulling car bodies down the line at a pace that never changed, never slowed, never allowed for hesitation. And underneath all of it, faint but constant, the AM radio playing from somewhere near the rear of the press shop floor. 6 o'clock in the morning, the gates on Phillip Highway opened. The car park filled from the outside in. By the time the first shift klaxon sounded, the floor was alive. At its peak in the early 1980s, the Elizabeth plant employed 4,500 people directly, on the line, in the paint shop, in the body press, in logistics and maintenance and quality control. Another shift would relieve them in the afternoon. A third ran through the night. The plant did not sleep. It was, by any measure, the industrial heartbeat of northern Adelaide, and for the families who depended on it, it was simply the centre of the known world. But the plant itself was only part of the picture. By the late 1970s, the ecosystem of suppliers that had quietly assembled itself around Holden Elizabeth had grown into something substantial. More than 120 component manufacturers operated across South Australia, the majority of them in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, in Salisbury, Edinburgh North, Gepps Cross, Para Hills. They made the things that most people never thought about when they sat behind the wheel of a Commodore. The wiring looms that ran through every door panel, the instrument clusters, the seat foam cut to precise tolerances, the brake calipers, the rubber door seals, the pressed steel floor pans. Small companies mostly, unglamorous work, but work that paid a wage good enough to own a house, raise children and retire on a pension without shame. In 1997, the South Australian government formalised what had already existed informally for years. Edinburgh Parks, a purpose-built industrial estate several kilometres north of the Holden plant, was established and marketed explicitly as a hub for automotive component suppliers. The logic was sound: consolidate the supply chain, reduce transport costs, build critical mass. Large billboards went up along the access roads proclaiming Edinburgh Parks as South Australia's engine of industrial renewal. For a time, the ambition seemed justified. And then there was the Commodore. Launched in 1978 as the replacement for the long-running Holden Kingswood, the Commodore was not simply a new model. It was a statement. After years of debate about whether Australian tastes were shifting towards smaller, imported vehicles, Holden had committed to a large, locally engineered rear-wheel drive car aimed squarely at the Australian family. The gamble worked. The Commodore became the best-selling car in Australia for the better part of 3 decades. Not because it was the cheapest option or the most technologically advanced, but because it felt in some way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore, like it belonged here. It was wide enough for Australian roads. It was powerful enough for the long distances between cities. It was the car that sat in the driveway on Christmas morning. The car that towed the boat to York Peninsula. The car that a father drove to Elizabeth every morning and came home in every afternoon smelling faintly of the factory. Behind the Commodore's success sat a wall of government protection that made the whole arrangement financially viable. In the early 1980s, the tariff on imported vehicles stood at 57.5%. That figure was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy choice maintained by successive governments to ensure that Australian-made cars could compete with foreign imports on price. The tariff was the foundation on which Elizabeth was built. Without it, the economics of manufacturing a relatively small number of cars for a relatively small domestic market simply did not work. In 1984, the Elizabeth plant was running 3 shifts a day. The Commodore line was at full capacity. The supplies in Edinburgh Parks and the northern suburbs were fully contracted. The TAFE colleges in Salisbury and Elizabeth were running apprenticeship programs that fed a steady stream of trained workers directly onto the factory floor. The footy clubs in the area carried Holden sponsorship on their jerseys. The pubs near the plant did their best trade on Friday afternoons. It was, by every visible measure, a system working exactly as it had been designed to work. What nobody standing on that factory floor in 1984 could fully see, or perhaps chose not to see, was that the wall holding everything up was about to develop its first crack. If Elizabeth was a city built to make cars, and making cars was the soul of Elizabeth, did anyone in Canberra ever seriously ask what would replace it if the cars stopped? In 1984, that question felt theoretical, almost impolite. Within a generation, it would feel like the most important question anyone had failed to ask. That year, a federal minister named John Button flew to Tokyo. What he carried with him was not a trade deal. It was a blueprint for reform, one that the industry had not requested and could not refuse. And when he landed back in Australia, the long, slow dismantling of the wall had begun. Chapter 3: Cracks in the Foundation. The Button Plan, Reform or Death Sentence, 1984 to 1992. John Button was not a villain. That is the first thing that needs to be said, and it needs to be said clearly, because the story of what happened to Elizabeth, and to the hundreds of small manufacturers who depended on Holden, is not a story about one man's malice. It is a story about a set of ideas that seemed entirely reasonable at the time, applied to an industry that was more fragile than anyone in Canberra was willing to admit. Button was the Minister for Industry in the Hawke Labor government. He was intelligent, pragmatic, and genuinely concerned about the long-term viability of Australian manufacturing. When he looked at the automotive industry in the early 1980s, what he saw was an industry kept alive by a tariff wall so high that it had never been forced to compete, never been pushed to become efficient, and was consuming hundreds of millions of dollars in government assistance every year to produce cars that, by global standards, cost far too much to build. He was not wrong about any of that. In 1984, Button announced what became formally known as the Motor Industry Development Plan, the Button Car Plan. Its logic was straightforward. The Australian market was supporting 13 different car models produced by 5 manufacturers: Holden, Ford, Mitsubishi, Toyota and Nissan, in a country of 15 million people. The volumes were too low. The duplication of investment was wasteful. The industry needed to consolidate, rationalise and expose itself to international competition so that it would be forced to become leaner and more capable. The plan set out to reduce the number of locally manufactured models from 13 to 6, grouped into 3 manufacturer pairings. It introduced phased reductions in the import tariff, dropping by 2.5 percentage points per year from 1988 onward, falling from 57.5% toward a floor of 15% by the year 2000. It also removed import quotas that had previously limited the volume of foreign vehicles entering the Australian market. When Button flew to Tokyo to brief the Japanese manufacturers on the plan's content, he was not asking for their opinion. He was informing them of the new reality. From this point forward, the Australian automotive industry would compete, or it would shrink until it could. In Canberra, the plan was praised as courageous economic reform. In the pages of the broadsheet newspapers, economists lined up to endorse it. The intellectual consensus of the era, shaped by the same current of economic rationalism that was simultaneously dismantling protection across farming, banking and telecommunications, held that open markets were self-evidently superior to protected ones, that competition produced efficiency, and that efficiency produced prosperity. What the consensus was slower to model was what happened to the people standing between the old system and the new one. In the northern suburbs of Adelaide, the Button Plan arrived not as an abstract policy document, but as a change in the behaviour of the companies that placed the orders. Holden, under pressure to cut costs and prepare for a more competitive environment, began reviewing its supplier contracts with new intensity. Prices were renegotiated downward, delivery standards were tightened. The implicit understanding that had existed between the plant and its local suppliers, that loyalty ran in both directions, that Holden would keep buying Australian-made components as long as Australian manufacturers kept supplying them, began to erode. For the larger suppliers, the adjustment was painful but survivable. They had the capital to invest in new equipment, the management capacity to renegotiate, the balance sheets to absorb short-term losses in exchange for long-term contracts. For the smaller ones, the family businesses, the single product specialists, the workshops that had tooled up to make one specific bracket or seal or trim component for one specific model, the new environment was something different entirely. Their entire business model had been built on the assumption of continuity. They had invested in specialised tooling that had no other application. They had taken on workers and premises and obligations on the basis of contracts that now felt considerably less certain than they had a few years before. They did not close immediately. That is the insidious quality of a slow, structural decline. It does not announce itself. It arrives as a slightly smaller order this quarter, a price reduction request that cannot quite be refused, a contract renewed for 12 months instead of 3 years. The machinery keeps running. The workers keep coming through the gate. But something in the texture of the business has changed, and the people who have run these operations long enough can feel it, even if they cannot yet name it. Ford lost $60 million in 1992. Holden cut hundreds of jobs across its operations. The mid-term review of the Button Plan in 1988 had recommended accelerating the reforms. The industry and the government's assessment was not adjusting fast enough. Further tariff reductions were brought forward. Further rationalisation was expected. And, in the Edinburgh Park's industrial estate, where the billboards still proclaimed a future of industrial renewal, the first 4 lease signs began appearing on the smaller sheds. Not many, not yet, but they were there. But the worst decision had not been made yet, and when it came, it would not come from Canberra. It would come from a boardroom on the other side of the world, in a city where nobody had ever heard of Elizabeth, South Australia, and nobody particularly needed to. Chapter 4. The villains arrive. Detroit decides, Canberra folds. The forces that sealed Elizabeth's fate, 1990s to 2008. By the mid-1990s, the Holden plant at Elizabeth was operating in a world fundamentally different from the one it had been built for. The tariff wall was coming down. The number of models had been rationalised. The workforce had been trimmed. And yet the plant was still running, still producing Commodores, still the largest single employer in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. To a casual observer, it might have looked like the system was holding. What the casual observer could not see was the architecture of dependency that now governed every decision made on Phillip Highway. Holden was not an Australian company. It had never been an Australian company in any meaningful structural sense. General Motors Holden was a subsidiary of General Motors Corporation, headquartered in Detroit, Michigan, a city 12,000 kilometres away and 11 time zones removed from the floor of the Elizabeth plant. In the years of tariff protection and limited foreign competition, that distance had mattered relatively little. The Australian operation was profitable, the market was captive, and Detroit was content to let the local management run the business as they saw fit. As the 1990s progressed and the competitive environment tightened, that distance began to matter enormously. Every major capital decision at Elizabeth, new model investment, platform upgrades, tooling replacements, now required approval from Detroit. And Detroit, by the late 1990s, was a corporation under its own considerable pressure. GM was losing ground to Japanese manufacturers in its home market. It was carrying legacy costs, pension obligations, healthcare commitments, an overextended model range that were quietly hollowing out its balance sheet. When GM executives looked at their global operations and ranked them by strategic priority, Australia was not near the top of the list. Australia was a market of 20 million people producing vehicles in volumes that, by global standards, were almost artisanal. The Commodore was beloved. It was also, from a purely financial perspective, an extraordinarily expensive car to develop and build in such limited numbers. Holden continued to lobby Detroit for investment, continued to argue the case for new model funding, and Detroit continued to approve, partially, conditionally, with strings attached and timelines compressed, because walking away from a profitable subsidiary in a stable market was not yet the obvious move. But the relationship had changed. Elizabeth was no longer a valued outpost of a global empire. It was a line item in a spreadsheet being scrutinised by people who had never set foot in South Australia and never would. Then came the Australian dollar. Through the early 2000s, Australia's resources boom drove the value of the dollar sharply upward. For most of the economy, this was welcome news. Imported goods became cheaper, overseas travel more affordable, the terms of trade favourable. For Australian manufacturers selling into global markets or competing against imported goods priced in foreign currencies, it was something close to catastrophic. The cost of building a car in Australia, when converted to US dollars for reporting to the parent company in Detroit, rose steeply, not because Elizabeth had become less efficient, but because the exchange rate had moved against it. A vehicle that had been competitively priced at the beginning of the decade was now significantly more expensive to produce in Australian terms, on paper, than equivalent vehicles being assembled elsewhere in the world. The factory had not changed. The accountants' spreadsheets had. And then came Thailand. In 2005, the Australia-Thailand Free Trade Agreement came into force. Under its terms, vehicles assembled in Thailand, including models badged as Ford, Holden and Toyota, could be imported into Australia with tariffs reduced to zero. Thailand had become, over the preceding decade, one of the most cost-competitive automotive manufacturing locations in the world. Labour costs were a fraction of Australian rates. Factory scales were enormous. Government support for the industry was direct and unapologetic. The results of the agreement were not subtle. In the years that followed, more than 2 million Thai-assembled vehicles entered the Australian market. In the same period, Australia exported to Thailand exactly 100 Ford Territory SUVs. 100 vehicles, against 2 million. In the northern suburbs of Adelaide, the component suppliers watched the import figures with the particular dread of people who understand exactly what the numbers mean. Every Thai-assembled Holden that arrived at an Australian dealership was a Holden that had not been built in Elizabeth. Every part in that Thai-assembled vehicle was a part that had not been ordered from the sheds in Edinburgh Parks or Gepps Cross or Salisbury. The mathematics were merciless and entirely straightforward. In 2008, Mitsubishi closed its assembly plant at Tonsley Park in the southern suburbs of Adelaide, eliminating 1,000 jobs directly and sending a further wave of disruption through the suppliers who had serviced it. Some of those suppliers had already been splitting their business between Mitsubishi and Holden. With Mitsubishi gone, Holden became their only customer, a situation that made them entirely dependent on a single buyer whose own future was now openly in question. The global financial crisis arrived in the same year. General Motors filed for bankruptcy protection in the United States in 2009, requiring a government bailout of historic proportions. The Australian government provided a $200 million line of credit to GM Holden to help it restructure through the crisis. Holden responded by cutting 500 jobs at Elizabeth in 2008 and another 500 in 2009. When Mitsubishi left Adelaide in 2008, taking 1,000 jobs with it, did anyone in the relevant government department seriously ask what would happen to the component suppliers caught between two shrinking customers, and plan for the answer? The evidence suggests the answer is no. By the end of 2008, the Edinburgh Parks industrial estate, the one the government billboards called South Australia's engine of renewal, had barely developed half of its 650 hectares. The remaining land sat unused. The for lease signs on the smaller sheds were no longer a novelty. They were a pattern. And in Detroit, the spreadsheets were being updated. The column marked Australia was getting harder and harder to justify. Chapter 5, The Abyss, The Announcement, December 2013 and the Domino Effect. In May 2013, the Coalition won the federal election on a platform that included, among its many commitments, a promise to cut $500 million in assistance to the Australian automotive industry. The argument was familiar, the same argument that had been made in various forms since the Button Plan 3 decades earlier. The industry was a drain on the public purse. It was propped up by subsidies that distorted the market. A competitive economy could not afford to keep paying manufacturers to build cars that the market, left to its own devices, would not sustain. The argument had a coherent internal logic. It also had a consequence that its architects either did not fully model or chose not to advertise. When a business is told clearly and publicly that the government support underpinning its viability will be removed in the near future, every other actor in the economy responds immediately, not at the future date when the support actually ends, but right now in the present, because that is how markets process information. Banks tighten lending criteria. Insurers reassess risk. Customers begin qualifying alternative suppliers. Investors stop committing capital. For the Holden plant at Elizabeth and for every component manufacturer in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, the election result in May 2013 was not a distant warning. It was an immediate change in their operating environment. 7 months later, it became official. On the 11th of December 2013, General Motors Holden announced that it would cease manufacturing operations in Australia by the end of 2017. The Elizabeth plant, which had been building cars since 1963, would close. The remaining workforce of approximately 1,600 people at the site would lose their jobs. The decision had been made in Detroit, with input from the Australian management in the context of the withdrawn government support and the ongoing financial pressure that had been building for years. The announcement was made on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, every component manufacturer in the Holden supply chain in South Australia had a new and urgent question to answer. Not about 2017, but about now. The Federation of Automotive Products Manufacturers issued a warning within days. More than 150 top-tier suppliers and upward of 40,000 jobs across the national automotive supply chain were directly exposed to the consequences of Holden's exit. In South Australia alone, the supply chain employed several thousand people, most of them in the northern suburbs, most of them in businesses that had been built specifically and exclusively to service a customer that had just announced its departure. The 4-year transition period, intended presumably to give the industry time to adjust, proved in practice to be something considerably more complicated than a grace period. For the large suppliers with diversified customer bases and strong balance sheets, 4 years was a runway. Time to find new markets, retool for different products, negotiate contracts in the defence or mining sectors that were beginning to look for local manufacturers. For the small ones, 4 years was something else entirely. It was 4 years of operating in a business environment where every structural incentive pointed toward closure. No bank would extend a new loan to a company whose primary customer had announced it was leaving. No major buyer would sign a long-term supply contract with a manufacturer whose future was openly contingent on a plant that had an expiry date. No new employees with options elsewhere would sign on. No owners with savings to deploy elsewhere would reinvest them here. The businesses kept their doors open. The machines kept running. The workers kept coming through the gates. But the underlying reality was already determined. The question was not whether these companies would close. The question was only when and in what order. Through 2014 and 2015, the consolidation began. Suppliers that had been operating in Edinburgh Parks and the surrounding industrial areas for decades began to wind down their Holden-related operations. Some found partial replacement work. Some managed to pivot, converting presses and fabrication lines to serve the construction or mining industries. A number succeeded, and their stories are real and deserve acknowledgement. But many did not. The closures happened quietly, one by one, without press conferences or parliamentary statements or the kind of public attention that had attended Holden's own announcement. A workshop in Salisbury that had made instrument panel components for 30 years shut its doors in March 2015. A metal fabricator in Edinburgh North that had supplied floor pan assemblies to Elizabeth for 2 decades laid off its remaining staff in mid-2016 and surrendered the lease on its shed. A rubber seals manufacturer that had operated in Gepps Cross since the 1970s supplying not only Holden but Mitsubishi before that, closed quietly in the summer before Holden's final year. There were no television crews outside those gates. There were no speeches from premiers or federal ministers. There was no ceremony of any kind. Just a forklift loading the last of the tooling onto a truck, a landlord changing the locks, a for lease sign going up where a company name had been. Back on Phillip Highway, the Holden plant was shrinking toward its final configuration. The workforce that had stood at 4,500 at the plant's peak, that had still numbered 1,600 at the time of the December 2013 announcement, was down to fewer than 1,000 by the time 2017 arrived. The third shift was long gone. The second shift was gone. One shift remained, running one line, building one model, the Commodore, for a market that was buying it in numbers that would have seemed unimaginable to the workers who had run 3 shifts through the 1980s. In Edinburgh Parks, the industrial estate that had been established specifically to serve the Holden plant, barely half the available land had ever been developed. The rest sat empty, flat, silent, bounded by chain-link fencing and the occasional rusting piece of equipment that had not been worth the cost of removing. The large billboards proclaiming South Australia's industrial future had not been taken down. They were still there, facing the access roads, offering their promise to an audience that had mostly already left. But not everyone had left. Some stayed until the very end. And what those people witnessed on the floor of the Elizabeth plant in the final months of 2017, and what the families of the parts makers experienced in the sheds around it, was something that no policy document had ever adequately described, and no government transition program had ever fully prepared them for. Chapter 6. The Final Day. The Last Commodore, October 20th, 2017. The last year of the Elizabeth plant had a quality that the people who worked through it have since described in remarkably consistent terms. Not chaos, not bitterness exactly, though there was bitterness. Something closer to a long, collective held breath. The knowledge of what was coming, fixed and immovable on the calendar, gave every ordinary day an extraordinary weight. The smoko at 9 o'clock, the lunch break at 12, the knock-off siren at 3, each one freighted with the awareness that there were only so many of them left. By January 2017, the workforce at Elizabeth numbered fewer than 1,000. The plant was building Commodores, sedans, wagons, the Ute variant, and a small number of Caprice limousines. The production rate had been scaled back to match what the market would absorb. The car park, which had once filled from the outside in before the first shift siren, now had empty rows near the gate. The component suppliers who had survived long enough to see 2017 were delivering their final contracted orders through the first half of the year. For most of them, the last delivery to Phillip Highway was not a moment they had been warned about in advance. It arrived simply as the conclusion of a shrinking order schedule. A driver would pull the truck up to the receiving dock, unload the last consignment, hand over the paperwork and drive away. No one came out to acknowledge it. No one marked it in any formal way. The dock workers who signed the delivery dockets had their own concerns. The relationship ended as it had increasingly been conducted in its final years, efficiently, professionally, and without sentiment. By mid-2017, the last of the major component suppliers in the northern suburbs had ceased their Holden-related production. Edinburgh Parks, by this point, had the atmosphere of a suburb the day after a long event has ended. The infrastructure still in place, the spaces still present, but the purpose that had animated them quietly withdrawn. Some sheds had new tenants, others were empty. The billboards on the access roads had finally been taken down, or had simply deteriorated to the point of illegibility. On the 3rd of October 2017, Toyota closed its assembly plant at Altona in Victoria. The last Toyota to be built in Australia, rolling off the line 17 days before the last Holden. Australia lost its second-to-last car manufacturer in a single afternoon without significant ceremony on a Tuesday. 17 days later, it was Elizabeth's turn. The morning of October 20th began before light. Workers who had been at the plant for decades arrived early, not because the shift demanded it, but because something in them could not bring themselves to be late on this particular morning. Some drove past the plant once before parking, as if checking that it was still there. Some had brought their children, Teenagers who had grown up knowing that their parent worked at Holden the way other children's parents worked at the school or the hospital. A fixed point, a given. Inside the plant, the final cars had been selected and positioned on the line days earlier. The last batch comprised a Commodore sedan, a Commodore wagon, a Commodore ute, and a Caprice limousine, each representing a variant that had defined the plant's output over its final decades. The last of these, a deep red Commodore 5/8 sedan, would be the final vehicle to move. It had been chosen deliberately. The Commodore in red was, for a generation of Australians, the definitive image of what Holden made. It was not a subtle choice. Nobody at Holden in its final year was particularly interested in subtlety. The ceremony itself was private. Fewer than a dozen journalists were permitted inside. There were no live television cameras broadcasting to the nation. The roughly 1,000 people in attendance, current workers, retired workers, union delegates, managers, a small number of government officials, gathered on the factory floor in the particular silence of a large industrial space that is not producing anything. The machines were still. The conveyor chain was still. The overhead lights burned as they always had, indifferent to the occasion. Several speeches were made. South Australian Premier Jay Weatherill spoke with a directness that went beyond the usual formulations of political tribute. His mother, he told the gathering, had worked in the car parts sector. His uncle had worked at Holden for 47 years. He was not speaking about an abstraction. He thanked the workers on behalf of all South Australians for what they had built, for how long they had built it, for the dignity with which they had conducted themselves through years of uncertainty and diminishment. Then the last red Commodore moved. It covered the final metres of the assembly line at the same pace every car before it had covered them. The pace set by the chain, unchanged across decades, calibrated for production rather than ceremony. It reached the end of the line. It stopped. Someone cut the engine. And the Elizabeth plant, which had been producing vehicles continuously since 1963, which had assembled 7.6 million cars across 59 years of operation, became a building that was no longer a factory. The silence that followed was absolute and almost physical. The kind of silence that only becomes possible in a space that has been defined by constant noise, and that people who had spent careers in that noise described afterward as something they had not been prepared for. The absence of the conveyor chain was the absence of a sound they had stopped consciously hearing years ago, and whose disappearance now made the air feel structurally different. People stood where they were for a time. Some embraced. Some walked to the exit without looking back. Some stood at the windows and looked out at the car park, at the empty rows near the gate, at the Phillip Highway beyond, at the flat northern Adelaide sky that had looked the same on every morning shift they had ever worked. Outside in the streets surrounding the plant, the suburb continued its ordinary Thursday. Traffic moved on Phillip Highway. A school bus made its rounds. The bakery 2 blocks from the plant gate opened for the morning. The life of Elizabeth went on, as it had always gone on, beside and around and despite the enormous fact of the factory that was now, for the first time in living memory, silent. 7,600,000 vehicles, not one of them built by a single pair of hands. Behind every Commodore, every Chimera, every Caprice, hundreds of workers, dozens of suppliers, a constellation of small businesses in unremarkable sheds in suburbs most Australians could not find on a map. A ceremony was held for the last car. Why was there never one for the last wiring loom, the last brake assembly, the last rubber seal delivered by a driver who turned his truck around and drove back to a workshop that would never open again? In Holden's final year, 85% of workers who had separated from the company in the preceding 4 years had found new employment. The statistic was cited frequently in the weeks that followed as evidence that the transition had been managed. It was a real number. It was also a number that said nothing about what those workers were doing or what they were earning or what it had cost them to get there. And it said nothing at all about the owners of the small component businesses, the people who had not been Holden employees, who had not been covered by the automotive industry transition assistance programs, who had simply been suppliers to a customer who no longer existed. Their stories did not appear in the transition statistics. They had not been counted in, and so they were not counted out. The red Commodore was taken by Holden as a museum piece. The line went cold. The lights were left on for a while, burning over an empty floor. Then, eventually, they too went out. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. What Elizabeth Became. The North of Adelaide, 2018 to present. The plant on Phillip Highway did not disappear overnight. Buildings of that scale and specificity, 123 hectares of pressed concrete, specialised tooling bays, paint shop infrastructure and body press foundations, do not simply vanish because the production line has stopped. They sit, they wait, they accumulate silence the way an old house accumulates dust, slowly and without drama, until the weight of what they no longer are becomes more present than anything they still contain. In the months after October 2017, the process of decommissioning the Elizabeth facility began. The tooling was removed, the conveyor systems were dismantled, the paint booths were drained and sealed. Contractors moved through the building in a sequence determined by salvage value and hazardous materials legislation, stripping out what could be sold and making safe what could not. It was methodical, unhurried work, the work of ending things properly, which is slower and less dramatic than the work of building them. The site itself became the subject of planning discussions, government announcements, and feasibility studies that proceeded at the pace these processes always proceed, which is to say, considerably more slowly than the community surrounding them would have preferred. Various proposals were floated for the land: light industrial redevelopment, a logistics hub, a technology precinct. Each announcement was met with cautious optimism by local officials and cautious scepticism by the residents of Elizabeth, who had been present for enough announcements over enough decades to have developed a measured relationship with official optimism. Meanwhile, the suburb absorbed the consequences of the closure in the way that working-class communities always absorb industrial loss, quietly, incrementally, without the kind of visible drama that attracts sustained national attention. The unemployment figures for the northern suburbs of Adelaide told part of the story. Before the Holden closure, the official unemployment rate in the area was already above 14%, more than double the national average, a figure that reflected years of earlier retrenchments and the slow erosion of the manufacturing base that had been underway since the late 1980s. Among young people under 25 in the area, the rate exceeded 40%. These were not numbers produced by the closure of October 2017. They were the accumulated consequence of everything that had led to it. Every plant that had scaled back, every supplier that had wound down, every apprenticeship program that had not been renewed. After October 2017, those numbers did not improve quickly. The workers who had been directly employed by Holden at the time of closure were covered to varying degrees by the federal government's Automotive Industry Structural Adjustment Program. Retraining assistance was available, counselling services were provided, a dedicated transition office operated in the northern suburbs, staffed by people working in good faith to help former Holden employees find new directions. The 85% re-employment figure that the government cited in the months following closure was real. Most former Holden workers did find work within a defined period. What the figure did not capture was the texture of that work. A 53-year-old panel press operator who had spent 30 years developing a specific and sophisticated set of skills in a specific industrial environment does not transition seamlessly into the available employment market of the northern Adelaide suburbs. The jobs that existed were frequently lower skilled, lower paid, and further from home than the job that had been lost. The transition happened. The cost of the transition, in income, in identity, in the particular dignity that comes from doing skilled work well, was not captured in any government statistic. And then there were the others, the ones the statistics had never counted. The owners and workers of the component manufacturing businesses that had closed in the years before October 2017, the ones who had been suppliers rather than Holden employees, who had not been covered by the automotive transition programs, who had simply been businesses that no longer had a customer, occupied a space that the policy architecture of the transition had not been designed to reach. Some had closed early enough to retain some equity from their businesses. Some had not. Some had taken on debt in the final years, trying to hold on long enough to find alternative customers, and had ended the process with liabilities rather than assets. Their stories are harder to find in the public record because they were never formally part of the public narrative. The closure of Holden Elizabeth was a named, dated, nationally covered event. The closure of a brake component manufacturer in Edinburgh North in the winter of 2016 was not. In Edinburgh Parks itself, the industrial estate that had been established in 1997 to serve the Holden supply chain, the aftermath was visible in a way that resisted easy reframing. Vacant lots that had never been developed remained vacant. Sheds that had lost their tenants stayed empty long enough to accumulate the particular look of spaces that have been abandoned rather than vacated, the weeds finding their way through the concrete aprons. The roller doors faded to a uniform, dusty grey. Some of the estate was genuinely repurposed. Defence-related manufacturing, which had a significant presence in the northern suburbs through the Australian Submarine Corporation and associated contractors, absorbed some of the skilled workforce and some of the industrial space. The skills that had built Commodores, precision fabrication, quality control, complex assembly, were transferable, and the defence sector valued them. It was not a complete answer, but it was a real one. Then, in February 2020, General Motors delivered a final verdict that rendered the entire preceding debate moot. Holden, the brand, not merely the factory, was to be discontinued. GM would no longer sell vehicles under the Holden name anywhere in the world. The remaining 800 Holden employees in Australia, mostly engineers and designers based in Port Melbourne who had been retained after the manufacturing closure, would be reduced to approximately 100 people managing a wind down. The Holden dealerships that had been assured in 2017 that the brand would continue as an importer began closing. The next-generation Commodore, which had come from Germany in 2018 without a V8 and had sold in numbers that confirmed every skeptic's prediction, was discontinued along with the rest of the range. 69 years after the first Holden rolled off a production line in Port Melbourne. 54 years after the first car was assembled at Elizabeth, the name was gone. When there is no longer a Holden, no factory, no brand, no car bearing that name on an Australian road, what remains of the 60 years of labour that built it? What does Elizabeth keep when the thing that defined it has been erased so completely that even the badge no longer exists? The answer, it turns out, is more complicated than either grief or resignation can fully account for, because some things did remain, and understanding what they were requires standing for a moment in the northern suburbs of Adelaide on an ordinary morning, not in 2017 but now, and looking carefully at what the decades of industrial history have actually left behind. Chapter 8. Memory and Legacy. The things that don't wash out. There is grease that never fully washes out. The workers who spent years on the floor of the Elizabeth plant, and the workers who spent years in the smaller sheds that surrounded it, carry it in the creases of their knuckles, in the particular way they hold a tool, in the instinct to look at a mechanism and understand immediately how it works and where it will fail. Skilled industrial work leaves its mark on the body and the mind in ways that do not disappear when the factory does. The knowledge remains. The capability remains. The habits of precision and patience and practical intelligence that are built across a working life in a serious manufacturing environment do not dissolve because the building has been decommissioned. This matters, not as consolation, it is not consolation, but as fact. Many of the workers who came out of Elizabeth and out of the component manufacturers of the northern suburbs found their way, eventually, into industries that needed exactly what they knew how to do. The defence manufacturing sector centred in the northern suburbs. The shipbuilding programs, the submarine maintenance work, the electronics and weapons systems contractors absorbed a significant number of former automotive workers and discovered, without great surprise, that people trained to work to tight tolerances in complex assembly environments were precisely the people they needed. The skills transferred, the wages in some cases were better. The work was different, but the underlying discipline was the same. The TAFEs in Salisbury and Elizabeth continued to run engineering and trades programs, not for the automotive industry, which no longer existed as a local employer, but for the industries that had moved into some of the space it had vacated. The pipeline of trained hands did not stop, it redirected. Some of the smaller component manufacturers found, in their final years of adjustment, that the capabilities they had developed for Holden had applications they had not previously considered. A metal fabricator that had spent decades pressing automotive components discovered that the mining equipment sector needed fabricated parts to similar tolerances. A plastics moulder that had supplied interior trim to Elizabeth found a market in the medical device industry. These transitions were not easy, and not all of them succeeded, but enough of them did to suggest that the industrial capability that had been built up in the northern suburbs of Adelaide over 60 years was not simply extinguished when the last Commodore rolled out of Elizabeth. It was dispersed, diminished certainly, dispersed but not entirely lost. And then, 3 years after the Elizabeth plant closed its gates, the world provided an unusually direct demonstration of what Australia had given up. When the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted global supply chains in 2020, Australia discovered with uncomfortable clarity the consequences of having exited manufacturing across multiple sectors simultaneously. Automotive parts, pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, medical devices, the list of products that Australia could no longer make for itself, and that could no longer reliably be sourced from a world in which every country was simultaneously trying to secure its own supply, was long and in some cases alarming. The intellectual case for economic rationalism that global markets would always supply what domestic production could not encountered a reality in which global markets had temporarily ceased to function. The workers who had been told in various formulations across 3 decades that Australia did not need to make things because it could always buy them more cheaply from somewhere else watched this unfold from the northern suburbs of Adelaide, with an expression that people who have been proven right about something painful tend to wear. Not triumph, something quieter and considerably less satisfying than that. 40 kilometres to the east of Elizabeth, at the Kenworth plant in Bayswater, Victoria, the assembly lines continued to run. Had run, in fact, without interruption through everything, through the Button Plan and the high dollar and the free trade agreements and the GFC and the pandemic. In 2021, the plant celebrated 50 years of continuous Australian manufacturing and the handover of its 80,000th Kenworth truck. The reasons for Kenworth's survival in the context of an industry that had otherwise collapsed are not mysterious. The trucks produced at Bayswater were designed specifically for Australian conditions. The road trains of the outback, the B-double configurations of the highway network, the specific weight and dimension requirements of Australian freight regulation. There was no Thai equivalent. There was no imported substitute that worked as well on an Australian road carrying an Australian load across Australian distances. The market for what Kenworth made could not be served from a factory on the other side of the world. The lesson was available if anyone had chosen to draw it early enough. Manufacturing that is genuinely adapted to the specific requirements of its market, that makes something the market cannot get elsewhere, is manufacturing that can survive globalization. Manufacturing that makes a generic product in a high-cost location, protected only by tariffs that are always subject to political revision, is manufacturing that is always one policy decision away from collapse. Elizabeth knew how to make cars. It made them well, and it made them for a long time, and the people who made them were proud of the work. But the cars it made were not irreplaceable. The moment the tariff wall came down far enough and the exchange rate moved far enough, and the parent company's boardroom priorities shifted far enough, the economic logic of building them here dissolved. That is not a moral failing. It is not a story about lazy workers or incompetent managers or a community that did not try hard enough. It is a story about the structural vulnerability of an industry that was always dependent on conditions it could not control. Decisions made in Canberra, in Detroit, in Tokyo, in the currency markets of New York and London, by people who were never going to be held accountable for the consequences on Phillip Highway. On an ordinary morning in Elizabeth today, the suburb goes about its life. Children walk to school. The shops on the main strip open. Traffic moves along the roads that the Housing Trust laid out in 1955, when the promise of the place was still entirely intact. The Holden plant on Phillip Highway still stands, its bones visible from the road, the scale of it still somehow startling, a building designed for a purpose it no longer serves. Somewhere in the northern suburbs, a man who spent 22 years operating a press in a components workshop is doing something else now. He is competent at it. He does not complain. But on certain mornings, in the particular way that skilled workers remember skilled work, he can still feel the rhythm of the press in his hands, the weight of it, the precision of it, the satisfaction of a thing made correctly to a specification that mattered. The factory is gone, the knowledge is still there. Somewhere in his hands, the work continues. Were we ever a country that could build things for ourselves? For one generation of Australians, in Elizabeth, in Edinburgh Parks, in the sheds and workshops of the northern suburbs of Adelaide, the answer was yes. They built it with their hands, shift by shift, for 60 years. And then the decisions came, one after another, from places far away, and the answer quietly changed. Not with a bang, not even, for most of them, with a ceremony. Just the sound of a press going still, a roller door coming down, and the particular silence of a workshop that has run its last shift. That silence is the real legacy. Not the cars, not the statistics, the silence. And the question it leaves behind, for anyone willing to sit with it long enough to hear it properly. What does a country lose when it decides it no longer needs to make things? Ask Elizabeth.